Hello and welcome back to the Land and Climate podcast. My name's Bertie Harrison-Braninsky, and today I'm talking to Richard Robertson about Canada's forestry model and whether or not it's truly sustainable. Richard has helped to develop and critique market-based initiatives about responsible forest management and certification for many years, and he's now a forestry campaigner at the North American organisation Stand.Earth. He recently contributed to a report developed by a coalition of NGOs that accused the Canadian government's own publications about forestry of becoming, quote, akin to an industry ad promoting questionable and misleading claims. Canada is often seen as a leader in sustainable forestry. The country's home to 9% of the world's forests and 35% of the world's certified forests, making these issues relevant to many countries that import wood products. So I was interested to ask Richard about the issues raised by this report.
I see internationally people looking to Canada to source things and saying it's a green and pleasant and very sustainable forest system we're in here. What we actually find is that the Indigenous peoples, the First Nations, have been disenfranchised. Their land has been exploited, and the industrial forestry is turning this over towards more of a plantation type of forestry, short rotations, less species diversity.
To help us visualise some of the forests we're going to be talking about, I began by asking Richard to describe the landscape around where he lives in the western edge of the country.
Yeah, I live in British Columbia, as I say, and I live on the Sunshine Coast, which is actually a ferry ride away from Vancouver. So it takes about a couple of hours, and you go through fjords. And then the forests themselves have largely been cut over. And so they've been exploited over, as I say, like the last century and a half. First of all, people would go in and cut the large trees. We live in what is actually a temperate rainforest. There were and still are in places some very large and what's known as growth forests with veteran trees of like up to 2,000, possibly even 3,000 years old. And they are giants. So we have a lot of Douglas fir, Sitka spruce, those kind of species, western red cedar. And you see in almost all of those forests that you visit, there are a few forest parks so people can go hiking, but you also see a lot of huge old stumps where the first round of cutting would have gone in and they'd have taken the really big trees. And this would be people on platforms, but at either side of the tree to lift them up above the huge buttress roots. They would cut it from either side with a handsaw. This is way back in the day, and then the mechanization came in with time. So you still see those forests, and you still see these kind of tombstones, if you like, of buttress trunks that are left in the forest. They have trees themselves like growing out of the top of them. It's like the forest regenerates out of the dead wood and out of these standing stumps that are left. There are still big trees around, and particularly in parks like that. But across much of the landscape, industrial forestry has come in, and they've clear-cut huge areas at a time. There are piles of brash around, and they're then often burnt. So a lot of the dead wood, a lot of the material that was in there gets taken out, and that can also lead to soil degradation. Soils get washed away. Those soils have taken millennia to develop as well, especially on steep mountains. The impact of clear felling across an area like that is huge.
How do you think Canada's seen internationally in terms of how well it does with forestry? And to what extent do you think that perception aligns with how well Canada's doing in reality relatively to other countries? I'm sure everywhere could improve, but do you think Canada's doing okay in general compared with other places, or maybe not?
The straight answer is no. Forests here are being very heavily exploited. On a time scale, I think this is one of the most important things in which these forests are being cut and then recut. What the forest industry say they're trying to reflect natural disturbances. So you'll see the clear cuts, as we talked about, over 100 hectares or so in many cases. Those clear cuts are supposed to mimic fire. So fire is a natural part of the forest being established, reestablished, reborn, if you like. It's a really interesting and powerful force. In the past, it would have gone through and ripped through forests on a maybe 250-year to 500-year, maybe longer cycle. And some of those forests, especially in the lowlands, the damper forests, those forests would likely have never been burnt or on a very, very long time scale. So what's happening with the forest industry is they're coming and cutting on a 60, 70, 80-year cycle. So it's within a human lifetime compared to the cycle that would have been here naturally. And so a lot of that system has been broken down and interrupted by this exploitation and the forest industry. They've been hugely exploited, and they're on a much more of an industrial and a product-focused basis. There's very little information out there about old-growth forests and primary forests. Growth forests are a subcategory, if you like, of primary forests. So the primary forests are those that have certainly not been touched by industrial forestry. Indigenous people have interacted with those forests and cultured them for millennia, as I say. But primary forests untouched by and large, and this subcategory, the old growth forests, which we might get into a bit more detail on, are where you have these huge old veteran trees as part of a mosaic. So not to forget the rest of the forest that's around them. But yeah, they're very iconic in that sense. And sadly, there's not the statistics and there's not the information across Canada to say what remains of this primary forest resource.
Maybe we should talk about some of the inaccuracies or misleading claims that your report identified in the government's report. The things that stuck out to me were this idea of deforestation. You've been talking about clear cutting a lot, mass logging of a particular area. I think that is probably the kind of image that people would think of when they hear the word deforestation. But your report talked about how in technical terms, deforestation just means land use change. So there's some ambiguity about what that word might actually mean, and maybe it's not what people would think. Also, some issues with carbon accounting. Could you talk to us a little bit about some of that?
Deforestation and degradation are two terms that I'd like to talk a bit more detail. Deforestation, and internationally, people tend to think of places like Indonesia, Brazil, Congo Basin, tropical rainforests, where land is cleared, turned over to agriculture. Soy comes to mind, rubber plantations, and of course, palm oil, which people would have heard of. I've seen a lot of this taking place, especially in Borneo. And to see palm oil plantations across those landscapes, I find shocking. And then to be able to go and see the ancient rainforests. So that's classically deforestation. That's what people think of. Degradation is where you exploit the forest in such a way that the values, we've worked a lot on this in Canada. We talk again about degradation and actually defining that term. But kind of layman's terms, it's really where you're going and exploiting a forest and reducing the values that would have naturally been there. So the ecology of that area, the species diversity, and also then the age class, meaning the taking out the older trees, going to a much younger and less diverse situation with the trees that you have there. More what people would think of as a kind of plantation, a type of forestry. I would say that is what's happened to the forests here in Canada, and systematically. So this exploitation has occurred through policies. It's kind of woven into the constitution, if you like, of the country. Here in British Columbia and elsewhere in Canada, they thrive from stumpage fees. So the government actually gets a return from every forest, every tree that's cut.
What are stumpage fees? How do they work?
Okay, so the government will designate an area of forest for cutting. They will then have forest companies come in and bid on that area. And then in order to exploit that area, the government will set a minimum cut, which the company is then bound to exploit that amount of timber, whether that's environmentally wonderful or not. They have to assess all of those things as well. The government is supposed to have gone through that process. But then the stumpage fee comes in. So every stump that's left is counted or accounted for, and the government gets a fee on every single tree throughout that cut. There's a conflict of interest. And this then pull between wanting to exploit the forests and bring in funding for government. That's set against then the pressure of needing forests for the climate and for people and for Indigenous peoples here, as well as ecology.
The issue here with misleading information being the government may say we've got very low rates of deforestation, but that's not addressing whatever the rates of degradation might be. And any of the numbers for forest cover or whatever might be including areas that have been logged. Is that right?
Exactly. The government do not count then any of those areas that have been clear-cut. You'll see these clear-cuts, to look at them, you'd say that's been deforested. Over time, they are supposed to be replanted and managed, and so then there's big human intervention in those spaces rather than having nature come in and do the work. That's where the degradation continues. So you have vast areas that are actually unforested and not thought of as unforested. They have no trees on them, very few trees. In the state where, for a very long time, they're not going to be covered in trees.
But simply because it's not become, say, a farm or there have been buildings built on it, it doesn't count technically as deforestation, right?
Correct. And this is important and has become vitally important in the international timber trade now since the European Commission, brought in a regulation called the EU Deforestation and Degradation Regulation, whereby they're not going to allow for any products to come in to Europe that have resulted from deforestation and degradation. And when that process was going on, the Canadian government was lobbying very hard. And as we have records to show that they were lobbying very hard with the European Union to try and ensure that the forests here were not recognized as degraded or deforested. The European Union held quite strong on that and now have a reasonably strong position on degradation. There's a huge exercise going on at the moment. They have a definition, but then to define on the ground which countries are a risk for you if you're in Europe of sourcing products from deforestation and degradation. So this is where Canadian government now is trying for themselves to define what is degradation. They're coming up with their own definition and trying to regain this international ground that they had. I mean, internationally, Canada's been very respected for their forestry and the forestry knowledge and seen as this sustainable and green. But that's not been the case, and that's what we're trying to highlight through this report. They're trying to regain this ground to show that they hold the keys to some kind of climate mitigation and good forest management, whereas, this report actually is showing that's certainly not the case. There's a huge market risk to them, I'd say, at the moment. And that's where NGOs here have also come together and come up with our own definition of degradation. And we're pushing this to government. We're talking to the European Commission as well to let them know that the forests have been exploited here, should be looked at in the light of forest degradation.
Wood product exports are a big part of all exports in Canada, right? I mean, you've got the figure here somewhere, 7.3% of Canada's total exports. Wood pellets for biomass energy is a key one, right? Are there others? How important is biomass within that?
The sawmill industry is obviously a big part of what we have here. So they will go and exploit the forest. They'll take the logs, saw them, to give you a kind of picture of how that industry works. Less than 50% of the log ends up as sawn timber. The rest of that is referred to by the industry as waste or residue. That waste or residue that they refer to from what was this amazing piece of forest is then put into other products, and this lower grade timber comes out as well. So the forest itself, where you're exploiting it, a lot of that doesn't actually come into being sawn timber that you would see as like 2x4s or huge beams that would have the longevity and store some of the carbon that forest was up there and storing in the past. And this is like another part of the industry's current push is to try and say, these products will store carbon for a long time. We can talk a bit more about that maybe. But when we get into then other products, so we have the paper industry here as well. And that's been declining over the last decade. So many mills have closed. A lot of the product for that would have been the timber that wouldn't be eligible for sawing, not of the quality that they need for saw logs, and also some of the other material that then comes off of those logs out of those sawmills. There's sawdust and there's chip material, and so there's several different markets there. We were talking about biomass. So you mentioned biomass and wood pellets. This is, if you like, a new market for the industry, which takes up some of that 50% of the log that doesn't turn into wonderful beams and sawn 2x4s, if you like. So that's all part of the profit of this industry and what keeps this industry driving further into the forest. So one of the big concerns right now with the paper industry falling away in many respects and big pulp companies like West Fraser closing mills in British Columbia and saying there's there just isn't the timber out there now for their purposes, for the pulp. Within the fiber basket that they've established within, they've exploited that now, and they're going elsewhere. For one, I can't see how that is sustainable. And now we have coming in on the back of that, this biomass industry, which is heavily subsidized from UK taxpayers and their energy bills, and also from the Canadian government, recognizing its clean energy, and US as well, pouring billions into this industry. The pellet industry is driving further exploitation of the forests here, as I've described already. Through the subsidization of this industry, they're able to go deeper into the forests and deeper into places where more, let's say, traditional products, such as pulp and paper, are not able to go. The hauliers, the people drive the trucks and go and get the timber, it's getting further and further away from the mills. They're having to go deeper and deeper into the forest and take 5-10 hours just to drive in there and then come back with this material to supply the industry. To subsidize the pellet industry is setting up false economics, if you like, in that sense. The last year or so, the federal government here in Canada has recognized biomass as a clean fuel. It's clearly not a clean fuel. And to illustrate that from this end of things, from the forest end of things, if you're going in and you're cutting trees, so the claim is that, you cut the forest and the forest will grow back. Trees grow back is that their simple math. Those trees will absorb the carbon that we've just burnt and thrown back into the atmosphere over in the UK in a coal-fired power station. Unfortunately, what's being emitted at that end in the UK is more polluting, is more carbon intense, and more carbon's going into the atmosphere than the coal that was previously burnt there. So then you're having, if you actually look at the carbon coming out of there, is one of the biggest carbon emitters, if not the biggest carbon emitter in the UK, is being counted as carbon neutral. The reabsorption of the carbon into the forests here is not going to happen, probably within our lifetimes. If we were aiming for 2030, that's 6 years away now. There is no way that those forests are going to regrow and reabsorb all of that carbon dioxide within that time. So you're setting off potentially what is a carbon bomb in this temperate rainforest. And I haven't even touched on the forest fires that we experience and we've experienced here in Canada. There's a huge fear now that those forests that are remaining, the forests that are being exploited, the fire intensity is going to increase. More carbon is going to be emitted into the atmosphere. Last year was the most devastating fire season. The smoke went down all the way down the East Coast. People in New York City could barely see out of their windows for the smoke. This is coming again this year. It's going to be worse from what we're predicting. The snowpack on the mountains here has just not come this year. Precipitation is much lower. The climate is changing. So these forests feel like they're coming to a tipping point. They generated the weather here. It's a rainforest. There's a lot of precipitation. There should be. That's failing this year. The fear is that we're reaching a tipping point. This is no longer going to be a carbon sink to absorb the carbon dioxide that Drax and others who are burning these materials, the pellets around the world, are saying is going to be carbon neutral.
I mean, this is particularly relevant for biomass because it's considered a renewable energy. There are extra sustainability credentials or criteria that often need to be met for government schemes and subsidies in other countries, but also for other wood products coming out of Canada. I'm sure there are sustainability standards that importer countries expect. Those countries and the companies should be doing their own due diligence, but ultimately this comes back to certification of sustainability standards and Canadian regulation of what trees and forests can be logged and how. Could you talk us through some of the issues that you're seeing at the beginning of the supply chain in that way? Is unsustainable wood getting certified as sustainable? Is unsustainable logging part of that supply chain? And perhaps, I know British Columbia is maybe the focus of this discussion. What should be happening at the government angle as well that isn't happening?
Especially in the UK, people would have heard of FSC, the Forest Stewardship Council, is the most respected certification scheme internationally. You'll see it on books, on paper, the tick tree logo. It's everywhere. Unfortunately, 20 or so years ago, British Columbia and the forest industry here said, there is no way I'm having a bunch of environmentalists tell me how to manage these forests. Anyway, they're exploited by these companies, and they said no to certification by FSC, Forest Stewardship Council, and those standards. A more industry-friendly scheme came along, PEFC, which is an umbrella organization for more industry-friendly forest certification. And that includes SFI, Sustainable Forestry Institute, the Canadian Standards Association. So those bodies then tend to certify the forests in the western part of Canada, here in British Columbia, as responsibly managed or sustainable. Back east, again, back in eastern Canada, Ontario, Quebec, there's a lot of FSC certification. They really got onto the back of it and certified a lot of the forests. I think the way that they've used it there has been that industry has become quite dominant within the FSC scheme, and clearly it's reliant on the funds that come through from the companies paying for their certification. So there's a potential for a conflict of interest within the system right there. That affects the standards, I would say. And as I say, I've worked on certification internationally, and I would say that countries where you have a lot of forests, a lot of forestry companies, here in Canada is a good example. Sweden would be a very good example. In Europe, there's a very strong industry influence, even on FSC certification. So then coming back to British Columbia, FSC and such schemes wanted to be able to still source timber from these places. And British Columbia, with very low FSC certification, lots of timber coming out, FSC wanted to produce products that included a mix of things from full certified products, but also from areas where the worst of the worst practices were not happening. And so they set up this whole other standard to try and risk assess areas like this. The biomass industry back in mid-2000s was then looking for, where are our timber baskets? Where are our fiber baskets? The two big fiber baskets they identified, British Columbia, one of them, and the other one, US Southeast. They have very different situations in terms of the forests and how the forests have been exploited in the past. But one thing they have in common is that neither of those areas have very much FSC certification. So then a new scheme came about, SBP, the Sustainable Biomass Partnership, as they were called then. Their mission, if you like, was to then try and find ways of demonstrating that the risk of getting timber from these places, from British Columbia and US Southeast, was fairly low, that you weren't necessarily exploiting Indigenous people's rights. And if you look at across the landscape on a risk basis, you can start to try and kind of eliminate some of these things or minimize them. This place in Canada and the US Southeast have been heavily exploited, and peoples have been pushed off of their lands, as we're seeing in the tropics and in other countries where this is called land grabbing. Land grabbing happened here legitimately, and so a lot of that's been minimized by these standards now. And so the standard that the UK government is using to say, oh, these forests are responsibly managed, has lent heavily on this new scheme, a very risk-based approach, Sustainable Biomass Partnership. And this is severely undermining the level of responsible forestry that at least FSC tried to push forward.
And I mean, British Columbia did actually try and put in a plan in 2020 to stop logging old growth, right? On a 3-year timescale, which has now ended. And I think that report that you've worked on has said that none of the objectives of that strategy have been achieved. And I know that you at Stand.Earth are working on a kind of satellite monitoring tool called forestry, showing how many areas within BC that are old growth or primary forest are still being logged. Was that plan made in good faith, do you think? And then industry has lobbied government out of those objectives? Are they too dependent on certain streams of income? Or is government and industry just totally working together on all of this, and that old growth plan was never likely to happen in a meaningful way?
All of those things you've highlighted have had an impact on the fact that, to date, the 14-point plan that the government came up with has not been implemented. Really interesting, I think, from an international point of view, is that the government here in British Columbia have recognized that the forests are degraded. This recognition comes through a plan, as you said, that they put together, an old growth review that they commissioned and drew in expertise from around the province back in 2020. Through that plan, old growth forests, not all the remaining old growth forests, but some particular growth forests that were identified as very high value, were then temporarily taken out of the system for logging. And this is known as the deferral system. So the logging was deferred, i.e., we'll put it off for a time. Unfortunately, government did not step in at that point to fully protect these areas. They said that they needed to consult with First Nations, who might have some of these areas within their territories. And unfortunately, that became a bit of an excuse for inaction. And so, yet again, I feel like First Nations were misused in this sense, rather than try and find some reconciliation and some way forward for their stewardship, which is what should be happening with these forests. We're now at 2024, and this 2020 plan, which was supposed to take 3 years to implement, has not been implemented. And what we've seen, instead of these areas being protected and not logged, is that they have been exploited on a grand scale. It's almost like industry was warned that these areas are going to be off limits very shortly. And we at Stand set up a satellite monitoring tool, as you say, called forestry. And this was able for the first time to gather geographic information systems and pull together various layers to show that roads were going into these areas. So we could pinpoint, this is one of these old growth deferral areas. We could pinpoint, this is the company that's now in there and exploiting it. A road going into this area is the first sign that it's going to be cut. It's going to be clear-felled. And then from there, the satellite image will show you the area being cut. The government had no system for this either. So that's been highlighted to them, and they seem to be trying to adopt a similar system now. Although they had no way of telling people that or showing people where these areas are and how they were not being logged. Clearly, they're being logged. We have some incredible images, road going in, followed by the logging, and then a fire going through. These areas that should have been protected are actually now being further exploited. And to be able to put some of that information through technology, such as forestry, into the hands of people on the ground. So there's some positives there that we're able to show that we're seeing what's going on. We're then able to highlight some of the false narratives that are coming out of government. Do seem to be moving forwards with some of the plans now. So that's one positive as well. And I think partly as well as a result of us highlighting the issues that are still ongoing.
So do you think it might be something that does eventually happen? Are changes coming, even if they're slower than they should be? Otherwise, what do you think the way forward is? I mean, is this an issue that could be resolved by elections? Is there a big difference across parties on these issues? Does something else need to happen systemically for things to change?
Right. There doesn't seem to be a huge difference across parties. The Liberal government came in with a big promise to protect old growth forests, of which there's like between 1% and 3% left across this huge landscape. And to give you an idea of scale, I think 4 Great Britons would fit together just to produce British Columbia. And so, yeah, we've got very little left of this old growth and primary, and yet it's still exploited. There's still industry is still seeing value in there and pulling product out. And wildlife and nature and First Nations and our climate are all suffering because of that.
Do you think international pressure from governments is what's needed for this to change? Perhaps through issues around sustainability and supply chains?
Yeah, I think so. It's really hopeful that the European Union has the deforestation and degradation regulation, and I really hope that they recognize what is going on here and see that the provincial governments here and across Canada are looking at their policies and trying to change them, because they also internally recognize, and the people here recognize, that these forests have been severely degraded by industrial logging. And so there has to be a paradigm shift. If we could turn this around and start to give the resources back to First Nations and their stewardship and look at forest restoration on a grand scale, then we might find some hope in pulling back from this precipice of huge forest fires and of this incredible landscape turning into a carbon bomb rather than what should be a huge benefit to saving our climate.
My thanks to Richard Robertson for coming on the show, and to Vasco Kostovsky for our audio engineering. If you want to learn more about these issues, we will link the new report in the podcast blurb below, and you can find more episodes and articles about forestry around the world, or the biomass industry, and many other issues on our site at landclimate.org. Please do subscribe, follow, and leave a review on your favourite podcast platform, and we'll be back in 2 weeks to hear about an investigation into Italian oil giant Eni and their biofuels projects in Africa. Until then, goodbye, and thanks for listening.